For this part of the tutorial, we are going to walk through a lesson in the Teacher's Guide. First, let's understand how the contents are organized. There are 5 proficiency levels that are divided into 8 units, as we've already talked about. All units follow the same basic format. Within a unit are 5 to 7 chapters, and within a chapter there are 5 to 6 lessons. A unit and the chapters within revolve around a theme. So, for example, in Unit 5, the theme is The World Around Me. As a rule of thumb, it takes about 2 to 3 weeks to cover the lessons in a chapter. Since each lesson generally takes about 45 to 60 minutes, a lesson does not necessarily equate to a daily session that you have with students. Let's look at Unit 5 in the Set 2 Teacher's Guide. Unit 5 is for the intermediate level. The first page of each unit lists the chapters in that unit. All the chapters relate to the same theme, the world around me. The general structure of a chapter is outlined here. Students begin a chapter by creating a manila folder that will serve as that chapter's portfolio container. Each lesson in the chapter builds and expands on the previous chapter. The first 2 lessons focus on the communication skills of listening and speaking. Lessons 3 to 6 emphasize reading and writing, at least for the 2nd through 5th grades, in an effort to develop the oral fluency with a literacy connection. In Lessons 1 and 2, you will introduce the target vocabulary using the picture and word cards and theme pictures. The picture and word cards are not intended to be used as flashcards. When introducing the vocabulary, use rich and robust vocabulary in your descriptions. You are not just building vocabulary to expand and use with sentences that target specific grammar forms and functions, but more critically, you are also building on students' current understanding of the vocabulary and experiences in their native language to make certain the language of the lesson is more meaningful. Building background knowledge gives students the opportunity to share their depth of understanding based on their own individual experiences, perceptions, and insights. For example, instead of just saying, "This is a bear," expose students to a variety of rich vocabulary by being descriptive about the bear. Say, "Look at this bear. See how big it is? Look at his shaggy brown coat. Do you notice his short, curly tail, even though he is so big? Do you know a bear eats both plants and animals? We call such an animal an omnivore. A bear is an omnivore." Once students have been introduced to the target vocabulary, use the sentence frames from Frames for Fluency to promote oral language rehearsal using the vocabulary. We will learn more about how Frames for Fluency works with Carousel in Section 5. Lessons 2 and 3 typically provide explicit instruction on the grammatical forms and language functions for that chapter. For example, in this lesson, after sufficient modeling and practice, students are comparing and contrasting different vehicles. What are grammatical forms and language functions? We've heard that term used many times in this tutorial. Current research points to the need for ELD or ESL teachers to provide direct instruction to English learners on language forms or grammatical forms, such as parts of speech, sentence structures, idioms, quoted versus reported speech, and so forth. ELs also need direct instruction on language functions such as naming people, places, and things, describing actions, comparing and contrasting, asking questions, classifying, predicting, analyzing, and so forth. For example, in this lesson, after sufficient modeling and practice, students are comparing and contrasting different vehicles using comparative adjectives. To be able to compare and contrast, which is the language function, students need to know how to use adjectives and conjunctions. Adjectives and conjunctions are the part of speech or grammatical form. The sentence frames from Frames for Fluency provide the scaffolding needed for students to frame these sentence structures. Model the sentence frame using the examples in the Frame's Teacher's Guide. Lesson 4 typically revolves around a suggested piece of literature that relates to the chapter theme. These read-alouds have been chosen to include the target vocabulary of that chapter. The lesson includes pre-reading, during reading, and after reading activities that correspond to the literature book. The literature lesson requires, at minimum, 2 30-minute class sessions. The literature-based sentence frames from Frames for Fluency can help provide the scaffolding students need to talk about and analyze the literature book. Lessons 5 and 6 provide additional explicit instruction on the functions and forms with the target vocabulary, as well as more challenging reading and writing activities and individual and group work. Now let's look at one chapter in detail. The first page gives you an overview of the vocabulary and key chapter forms and functions. The target vocabulary is organized by part of speech. The column called Other contains content area and academic vocabulary related to the chapter. Below that is a summary of the key forms and functions for the chapter. The bottom half of the page describes the content emphasis for this chapter and the reading selection aligned to that chapter. A specific piece of literature has been chosen to provide additional context for the vocabulary and language. There are also suggestions to enrich the classroom environment as it relates to the topic of that chapter and directions for assessment. We will look at assessment in greater detail in Section 4. The next 2 pages lay out the specific skill emphasis and objectives for each lesson in the chapter. These key objectives align to national English proficiency standards, such as TESOL and WIDA, as well as a cross-section of state standards. For example, Lesson 5 reinforces the target vocabulary learned in earlier lessons while focusing on explicit grammar instruction of the future tense. Students will then do different activities using the future tense. It is very important that at the end of a lesson, you review these lesson objectives and be certain that students have achieved and mastered them. The key objectives are reviewed and reinforced in subsequent chapters and units. Before you start a chapter, make sure you have the materials listed. Realia related to the chapter topic is very important to make the lesson and target vocabulary come alive for English learners. These are just some suggestions of realia to enhance your instruction. Each lesson is divided into 3 parts. The lessons embrace the research-based framework of the gradual release of responsibility. I do it, we do it, and you do it. In second language teaching and learning, this powerful framework, based on the work of Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry, suggests that the teacher models the language expectations of a lesson, after which students are guided in the use and practice of the language. After sufficient practice, students assume ownership of the language for application and use in creative, authentic, and novel situations. In the Carousel lesson plan, the I Do It section is called Presentation, where the teacher models behaviors or demonstrates skills. The We Do It section is called Practice, where the teacher guides practice with students. And the You Do It section is called Apply and Extend, where students are working independently in small groups or pairs to complete an activity to demonstrate their learning. To help you prepare for a lesson, pay attention to this checklist of components and materials that are needed for the lesson. This checklist can be found at the beginning of each lesson. To culminate a lesson, there is an activity to involve students' family members. The Observing Student Progress box is a reminder of the objectives students should have met by the end of the lesson. Before moving on to the next lesson, be sure students have mastered these objectives. Following the last lesson is always the evaluation section of the entire chapter, which is a summative assessment for that chapter. You have two choices for assessment: the Carousel testers, which are a more formal test covering all 4 domains, listening, speaking, reading, and writing, or the informal end-of-chapter listening and speaking interview and the reading and writing test. We will learn more about assessments in Section 4. Sponge activities at the end of each chapter are a great way to provide additional reinforcement to students who need more practice. Creative Ideas activity books provide additional practice of the target vocabulary and grammatical forms of that lesson.